I have told this story to exactly one person before today, and that was Mabel herself, on a cold November morning 11 years after I left her. I told it badly the first time, halting, incomplete, with too much silence where the words should have been, and she listened without helping me along, which was exactly what I deserved. I'm going to try to tell it right now, from the beginning, the way a man ought to have been able to tell it when it mattered. In October of 1871, I rode out of Sycamore Crossing without speaking to Mabel Doss, and I did not come back for 11 years. We were 8 days from being married. She had already pressed the dress. I know this because she told me so, 11 years later, in a voice that was perfectly level, the way her voice always was when she was holding something still inside herself by main force. She said, "I had already pressed the dress, Clem," and that was all she said about it for a long while. What I was, in those years, was a courier for the Territorial Marshal's Intelligence Network. That is a dignified name for what was essentially a man on a good horse who knew how to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open, moving between outposts and safe houses and marshals' offices across 4 territories, carrying dispatches that could not be trusted to the postal system. The network existed because the postal system was compromised in places, and because certain information needed to move fast and arrive clean, and because certain men had a talent for traveling without drawing attention to themselves. I had that talent. I was unremarkable to look at. Medium height, medium build, a face that settled into the landscape without snagging on anyone's memory. My horse was a brown mare named Petra, with no distinguishing marks. We suited each other well enough that people remembered the horse before they remembered me, which was the effect I required. I had known I was going to be called up. I had known it since the spring. The man who ran the western branch of the network, a former Army officer named Briggs, whom I never met in person and communicated with only through the dispatches themselves, had been signaling for months that a particular operation was coming, one that would require a courier who could ride a circuit between a dozen locations without any of those locations knowing the others existed. The pay was good. More importantly, there was a man in the network's eastern arm who had been selling information to a land syndicate that was using it to jump cattle range claims ahead of legitimate settlers. Families who had put years of work into their land were being pushed off it before they could get the papers filed, and the syndicate was doing it legally enough that the county courts could find no remedy. Briggs wanted the man found and the chain he was feeding cut. I had been tracking threads of that chain for 2 years, and I knew it better than anyone in the network. And I told Mabel none of this, not a word of it, not because I didn't trust her. I trusted Mabel Doss more than I have ever trusted any living person, but because the network's operating rule was absolute. You do not tell anyone what you are, what you carry, or where you go. Not a wife, not a father on his deathbed, not anyone. The people who made that rule had thought hard about it, and they were right to make it, and I had agreed to it when I signed on in the spring of 1866. What I had not anticipated, in the spring of 1866, was Mabel. I met her in the autumn of that same year, at a postal auction in Sycamore Crossing where her father, Wallace Doss, was transferring the post station contract to her name. She was 22 and had been doing the actual work of running the station for 3 years, while her father's health declined. She had a round, direct face and dark eyes that assessed you without embarrassment, the way a person looks at something they are deciding whether to trust. She looked at me that way for a moment, and then she looked at the papers in front of her and continued with the auction. I stayed in Sycamore Crossing for 9 days on that trip, longer than I had any operational reason to. And by the end of the 9 days I had found 3 separate errands that required me to stop at the post station and one that required me to be in the same county at supper time. We were not impulsive people, either of us. We took 4 years about it. We wrote letters, real ones, with our real names, which is something I could not do from the field. When I was passing through Sycamore Crossing, because I was always just passing through, always on my way to or from somewhere I could not name. She noticed this. She asked me once, in the spring of 1870, what exactly I did when I was away. I told her I was in the freight business, which was true in a general way and specific in none. She looked at me with those direct eyes and said, "You don't talk like a freight man." And I said, "How does a freight man talk?" And she said, "He tells you where he's been." I did not have a good answer for that. I deflected with a question about the new postal routes coming through the county, and she let me deflect because she was a patient woman, but I saw in her eyes that she filed the thing away and did not discard it. The closest I came to telling her was the winter of 1869, when I was laid up for 6 weeks at her station, with a fever that came out of a river crossing in bad weather. She nursed me through it with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, and there were nights when I was not entirely sensible and said things that I could not recall clearly afterward. I was afraid for a week after I recovered that I had said something specific. She never indicated that I had. Either I hadn't, or she had made her own decisions about what she would pretend not to have heard. I believed then, and believe still, that it was the latter. She accepted the proposal in September of 1870. I had set the date for October of 1871 because I believed, in September of 1870, that I would be clear of the operation by then. I was wrong. The chain went deeper than Briggs had estimated, and the man we were looking for had more reach than we knew, and by August of 1871, I was riding a circuit so tight I could not have reached Sycamore Crossing in 8 days if I had pointed Petra at it and ridden flat out with no stops. And then, in the first week of October 1871, Briggs got a message to me through a dead drop outside of Millbrook that said, "The circuit continues. You cannot go dark. If you go dark now, we lose the chain." I had 8 days until the wedding. I made the worst decision of my life in about 4 minutes of thinking, standing at a watering trough in Millbrook at 6 in the morning. I decided that I could not send Mabel a letter explaining why I was not coming, because any letter I sent through the postal system, her postal system, the station she ran, would be read, not by Mabel, by the county agent who processed the Sycamore Crossing mail at the Millbrook sorting office, who had been identified 3 weeks earlier as one of the links in the syndicate chain. If that man read a letter from Clem Farrow to Mabel Doss in Sycamore Crossing explaining that Clem Farrow was a courier for the Territorial Marshals Network, the chain would scatter. 6 months of work would die. 3 range families who were about to be jumped off their land would have no recourse. So I sent nothing. I told myself I would explain when the operation was over. I told myself it would be 3 months. It was 2.5 years before the chain was fully cut, the man in the eastern arm named and removed, and Briggs's network retired, with a quiet letter of commendation that I still have somewhere in a saddlebag, unread. By then I had been absent for so long that I did not know how to go back. I knew Mabel. I knew what 2.5 years of silence, with no explanation, would have done to her opinion of a man. I knew that showing up and saying I'm sorry, it was the government, would sound like the cheapest excuse in the history of cheap excuses, and that even if she believed me, which she might, because she was not a fool, the believing would not undo what the silence had cost her. I stayed away another season, thinking I would find the right words. Then another. Then 3 more years. Then I stopped counting. I want to be clear about what those years were like, because it would be convenient for me to say I was serving some high purpose, and let that cover the whole of it. The truth is more specific and less flattering. I had work I understood, and I did it well. After the network retired, I found work as a scout for a land surveyor, which suited my skills. Long days alone on horseback, moving through country that needed mapping, no one to account to and no one waiting. I was good at being alone. I had spent years training myself to it. What I was not good at, and what I did not know how to fix, was the fact that I had spent so long moving that I had begun to think of motion as a permanent condition rather than a choice. The surveying work took me through 3 territories over 4 years. After that I spent a season guiding supply wagons on a northern route, and a year working water rights assessments for a territorial land commission, and 2 years helping a rancher near the Colorado border set up a new spread on land he'd bought sight unseen. I was useful to people. I was present to no one. In the evenings I would make camp or take a room at whatever way station was nearest, and I would cook whatever I had, and I would eat alone, and I would go to sleep, and in the morning I would ride out and do what the work required. It was a life. It was not a life I had chosen so much as one I had slid into by failing to choose anything else. Every October I wrote a letter to Mabel. I don't know why October. I think it was because October was the month it happened, the month I wrote away, and so every October I felt the weight of it more precisely than other months, the way a man's bones ache in the joint where an old break healed. I would buy a piece of paper at whatever general store was nearest and write her a letter by lantern light in whatever room I was sleeping in, and I would tell her everything I could not say, where I had been that year, what I had seen, what I was sorry for, why I had not come back yet, what I thought about when the nights ran long. I wrote those letters the way a man talks to himself when he has been alone so long he has stopped being able to tell the difference between thinking and speaking. I wrote them without editing, without revision, without any thought of how they would sound to another person, because I knew they would never be read by one. I was writing for myself, mostly. I was keeping a record of a debt I owed and could not pay. I never sent them. I folded each one carefully and tucked it into the lining of my coat, in a seam I had opened with a pocket knife, and re-sewn myself in the autumn of 1872, after writing the first one. I kept the coat. It was a good coat, heavy canvas, elk-hide collar, double-stitched at the shoulders, and I maintained it carefully because it was the thing I treated most carefully, and I knew why. By October of 1882, there were 11 letters in that lining, stacked in the order I had written them, each one a year of my life, folded into a 4-inch square. What broke the pattern was not courage. I want to be honest about this because courage would make a better account, and it would not be true. What broke it was Petra dying. She was 21 years old, which is a long life for a horse, and a longer one than I had any right to ask of her. She had carried me through 4 territories and 11 years and every kind of weather the frontier produces, and she had never been difficult about any of it. She went quietly in the night in a corral outside of a place called Garnet Station in October of 1882, in that same coat-riding month that had always been the heaviest one. I found her at first light and buried her before noon, which took most of the morning because the ground was hard and she was not a small horse, and when I was done, I sat on the rim of the corral and understood, in a way that I had been working up to for years, that I was 53 years old and I had no one in the world who would notice if I did not appear. I do not mean that as a complaint. It was simply a fact that arrived that morning with the kind of clarity that a man can only ignore if he is moving fast enough to outrun it. I had been moving fast for 11 years. I had run out of horse. I sat at the corral rim for a long while. The October sky was the color of old tin, and a cold wind was coming out of the northwest, and across the road from the Garnet Station corral there was a general store with a lamp in the window and the smell of wood smoke coming from its chimney. I thought about going in and buying paper. I thought about what I would write. I thought about 11 sheets of paper folded in my coat lining and a woman in Sycamore Crossing who ran a post station alone, and whether she was still there, and whether she had married someone else, and whether any of it was any longer my business to wonder about. I thought about those things for about an hour. Then I went and bought a horse. The gray gelding at the Garnet Station livery was a calm, plain-spoken animal, not fast, not showy, built for distance and steady work. I named him Cord because he had the temperament of something that held things together. The liveryman gave me a fair price and threw in a good blanket, and I loaded my saddlebags and pointed Cord northwest. It took 11 days. I did not let myself think too carefully about what I was going to say when I got there, because I had 11 years of practice thinking about that, and it had produced 11 unsent letters and nothing else. Whatever I was going to say, I was going to have to say it to her face. Sycamore Crossing had grown some since 1871. There was a proper mercantile where the tack shop had been, and a 2-story hotel at the east end of the main street with a painted sign that said Crossing House, and the road in from the west had been graded and graveled. The depot had been rebuilt in stone. The whole town had the look of a place that had found its footing and intended to stay. I rode in on a gray Tuesday morning in November, with a cold wind behind me and the smell of snow somewhere north of the mountains, and I felt the peculiar sensation of a man returning to a place that has continued without him, which is both reassuring and humbling in equal measure. The post station was where it had always been, on the east side of the main street, 2 lots south of the Mercantile, a long, low building with a covered porch and the official postal placard beside the door. It had been recently whitewashed, bright white against the gray November sky, and the sign on the porch rail said, "Doss Post Station," in good, clear painted letters. The chicken yard behind it was full of hens. The orchard I could see past the corner of the building had 4 apple trees, stripped now, the last fruit long since brought in. There were geraniums in a window box on the south face of the building, brown and done for the season, but the box was painted and sturdy. Someone had built that box with care. I tied cord to the post and went inside. There were 3 people waiting at the counter for their week's mail. A heavy-set man in a canvas coat who had been running the feed store when I left and looked 10 years older and exactly the same. A young woman with a market basket who I didn't know, and a boy of about 9 who was standing very still and watching me with the frank curiosity that children aim at strangers in small towns. There was a smell of wood smoke and paper and something faintly like cedar, which was the smell I remembered. The counter was the same dark oak. The sorting shelves behind it had been expanded and reorganized, and there was a telegraph receiver on a side table that had not been there in 1871. Mabel was behind the counter with her back to me, pulling envelopes from a sorting shelf. Her hair had more gray in it than it had in 1871, woven through the dark in streaks that caught the light when she moved. It was pinned up the same way she had always worn it, not elaborately, but neatly, the way a person wears their hair when they have work to do and do not want it in the way. She was moving with the precise, unhurried efficiency I had remembered exactly right for 11 years, her hands sorting and stacking with the ease of long practice, reading the addresses without stopping the motion. She turned around because the room had gone quiet. I had prepared nothing. I had 11 letters in my coat lining and no words in my mouth. I had ridden 11 days, and I had thought about this moment for 11 years, and I was standing in the post station with my hat in my hand and no more to offer than my own face and the fact of having come. She looked at me for what I think was about 4 seconds. Her face did not change in the way faces change when they are surprised. No sharp intake, no step back. It changed in a smaller and more controlled way, a tightening around the eyes, as if she had been expecting something for a long time and had begun to doubt it and was now recalibrating herself to the fact of it. Then she said, in a voice that was perfectly even, "You look older." I said, "Yes." She said, "Can I help you?" It was not a question. It was the thing you say to a stranger in a post station, offered in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but carefully, precisely neutral. I said, "I came to see if there was work. Anything you need done around the place. I'm competent with timber and fencing, and I'm a fair hand with a water system if yours is giving you trouble." She looked at me for another moment. She glanced at the 3 waiting customers, who were all watching with the unabashed interest of people in small towns who understand that they are witnessing something and who have no intention of pretending otherwise. Then she looked back at me. She said, "The south fence needs work. The post barn needs the roof shored. And the well casing has been settling on the north side for 2 seasons. I said, "I'll start with the fence." She said, "Good. There's a tool shed around the back. You'll find what you need in it." Then she turned to the heavy-set man in the canvas coat and said, "Elton, here's your week's, and there's a parcel from Millbrook. It's the one you were expecting." She set a bundle on the counter, and he took it and paid his postal fee and went out without looking at me again, which was more grace than I had any right to expect from a man who had probably known Mabel Doss for 20 years. I went outside and found the south fence. That is how it began. Not with what I had imagined across 11 years of lantern-lit October letters, the explanation, the apology, the unfolding of the whole truth, but with a post-hole digger and a length of split-rail cedar in the November wind. The fence ran the length of the south pasture, about 200 yards, and 4 of its posts had rotted at the base, and 3 more were leaning badly enough that the rails were pulling loose. It was a week's work done properly, and I worked it properly, pulling the bad posts and digging the replacements to the right depth in cold ground, and setting the rails level, and driving the pins true. I worked until the light was gone, which in November is not long, and when I came in at dusk, she had a plate of food on the table in the back room that served as the station's kitchen, ham and roasted potatoes, and a piece of cornbread, still warm, and a place set with a fork, and a mug of coffee. She was sitting at the other end of the table with her own mug and a stack of postal records she was auditing, making small, careful marks in a ledger with a pencil. We ate without talking. When I was finished, she said, "There's a room in the post barn, a cot and a small stove. You can sleep there." I said, "Thank you." She said, "The stove needs to be going by dark in this weather. There's wood stacked beside it." I said, "I'll see to it." She went back to her records and I went to the barn. I lay on the cot that night and listened to Cord moving in his stall and thought about all 11 letters in my coat lining and whether there was any version of this that ended somewhere better than where it began. I thought the odds were poor enough that a reasonable man would have pointed Cord south in the morning and let her have the fence for what it was. Repayment on an old debt, nothing more. But I was 53 and I had run out of horse and out of the particular kind of restlessness that had kept me moving for 11 years, and Mabel's south fence needed 6 more posts and another 4 days of work, and I was not going anywhere until it was done. She did not ask me anything for 4 days. She was busy. The post station was a real operation now, more serious than it had been in 1871, with sorting and dispatch and a parcel service and a twice-weekly connection to the telegraph office 2 streets over. A girl named Runa came in from town 3 mornings a week to help at the counter, a steady young woman of about 20, with a quick mind for postal logistics, who clearly thought well of Mabel and ran her side of the counter with matching efficiency. They worked together without friction, the way people work when they have been doing it long enough to know each other's habits. I worked the fence. I worked carefully, measuring twice and setting each post plumb, because the work was the thing I had to offer, and I was not going to offer it carelessly. The weather held gray and cold but stayed above freezing, which was a mercy. By the 4th day I had the south fence done and had started on the barn roof. The east section had a split rafter that was letting the weather in and needed to be sistered and resheathed. I went up on the roof in the morning and worked until the light gave out. On the 5th day she came out to the barn in the late morning, while I was working the rafter, and said from the ground below, "You owe me an explanation." I climbed down and stood facing her. I said, "Yes, I'll tell you everything I'm able to tell you." She said, "That's an odd way to put it." I said, "There are parts I couldn't say then for reasons that made sense at the time and that I can say now. There are no reasons left. I'll give you the whole of it and let you decide what to do with it." She looked at me steadily. Then she said, "Come inside when you've cleaned up. I'll put the kettle on." She turned and went back into the station. I climbed back up and finished the section I was on, because the rafter needed to be sistered before I could leave it, and then I cleaned up at the pump in the yard and went inside. She was at the table with 2 cups of tea and the blue willow pot that had belonged to her mother, which was the same pot it had always been, and seeing it on the table almost undid me before I had said a word. I sat down across from her and told her about the network. I told her about Briggs and the dispatches, and the compromised postal system, and the land syndicate, and the man in the Eastern Arm who had been jumping range claims. I told her in detail and in order, because she deserved detail and order, not a summary. I told her what the network required and why it required it, and what I had known before I proposed to her, and what I had failed to account for. I told her about the dead drop in Millbrook in October of 1871, and the county agent who had been reading outgoing mail, and the 4 minutes at the watering trough, and the decision. I told it plain, without softening the parts that needed no softening, and without adding explanation to the parts that had none. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She was looking at the table, turning her tea mug in small increments, the way she sometimes turned a pen when she was thinking. Outside, the wind moved through the bare apple trees in the orchard, and the hens made the low conversational sounds that hens make when nothing alarming is happening. She said, "You could have found another way to send word. Even then, a rider, someone you trusted." There were people in Sycamore Crossing you'd spoken to over the years. I said, probably. The risk was real, but it was not absolute. If I'd thought harder for longer than 4 minutes, maybe I'd have found a way that didn't expose the chain. Maybe. She said, but you didn't. I said, I didn't. I made the fast decision, and I lived inside it for longer than I should have. She said, and after, when the network was over. I said, after, there was no operational reason. There was only the fear of what you would say, and the years that kept stacking up, and the fact that I had gotten better at moving than at stopping. She said, were you ever going to come back? I said, every October I thought I was. Every October I was somewhere else by November. She looked at me then, a direct, measuring look. She said, that's honest at least. I said, it's the only thing I've got left that's worth offering. She picked up her tea mug and held it in both hands and looked at the window. After a while she said, I want to know about the years. Not what you were doing, what you were thinking, what it was like. So I told her that too. Not that afternoon. That afternoon she had mail to sort and I had a roof to finish. But over the next week, in pieces, in the evenings and the early mornings, I told her what the years had been like. Where I had slept and what I had thought, and what had made the time hard, and what had made it less hard. I told it without making myself into something I wasn't. A man who had been competent and useful and present to no one in particular. A man who had organized his days around work, because work was simple, and the rest of it was not. She listened to all of it the way she listened to everything, without interrupting, without visibly judging, filing what she needed and setting aside what she didn't. She asked questions at the edges of things, what the surveying work had required, whether the northern supply route had been rough going in bad weather, what the land commissioner had thought of his own assessments, the questions of a person who was building a picture, not deciding a verdict. There was a man in town named Harker, a widowed grain farmer from the east side of the valley, steady and decent and not young, who came by the post station on Thursdays to collect his mail and stayed for coffee. He was courteous to me in the careful way that a decent man is courteous to someone whose purpose he has not yet determined. He would shake my hand when he arrived, and ask after the work, and drink his coffee at the far end of the counter, and he and Mabel would talk about the valley, and the weather, and the postal route changes, and I would find a reason to be outside, or on the roof, or at the well. He was not unkind to me. He was simply a man who had known her for years, and was watching to see what I was. On the third Thursday he said to Mabel, while I was outside stacking split wood, "Is he staying?" She said, clearly enough that I could hear it from the woodpile, "I don't know yet." He said, "All right." She said, "It's my decision to make, Harker." He said, "Of course it is." He drank his coffee and left, and shook my hand on the way out with the same measured courtesy as before. He was a good man. I could see plainly that she had good options and that I was not obviously among them, and I understood why. I finished the barn roof at the end of the second week. The third week I dug out the well casing on the north side, which had been settling in increments for 2 seasons and was beginning to let surface water in. It was cold, dirty work, down 4 feet in clay soil that was starting to stiffen at depth with the early cold, and I reset the lower course of the casing stones and packed the surround with clean gravel and refilled the trench in 2 days. Then I looked at what else needed doing. The north pasture gate was dragging on a worn hinge pin. A section of porch board on the east side had gone soft. The drainage channel behind the chicken yard had silted up enough to hold water against the foundation wall. I worked through all of it, taking each thing in turn. She fed me twice a day at the same table. She did not make conversation about my staying or leaving. She talked about the postal work, the weather moving in, what the County Road Commission had done about the Millbrook connection, whether the orchard's yield had justified the pruning she'd had done in the spring. She talked about the work of her life, which was a substantial and well-organized life, and I listened and asked questions where I had them, and we spent those evenings in the back kitchen that way. 2 people talking about practical things while the stove ticked and the lamp burned and the night came down outside. It was comfortable in a way that surprised me. I had not been comfortable in a room with another person in a very long time. The first hard frost came in the 4th week, a silver-ground frost, creeping in from the northwest in the small hours, frosting every window pane and turning the last of the dead grass in the orchard stiff and glittering. I was up before first light, as I always was, and I built up the stove in the post barn and then went out to the woodpile and split wood for 2 hours, against what was clearly coming, the real winter, not the previews. The cold had arrived with real intent. You could smell the depth of it in the air, that particular smell of cold that has come a long way and intends to stay. When I came in for breakfast, she was already at the table, with the postal accounts open, a cup of coffee at her elbow, making small notations with a pencil. She set a plate in front of me without looking up. I ate. She worked. The stove ticked as it took the heat. A jay landed on the sill of the east window and looked in, unimpressed, and left. After a while she said, still looking at her accounts, "Your coat is thin for this kind of cold." I said, "It's held up." She said, "I'll mend it properly if you leave it with me. There's a place in the lining that looks like it's come open along the bottom seam. I can reinforce it." I set my fork down. She looked up at me. She saw something in my face and waited. I said, "Mabel." She said, "What?" I said, "That place in the lining. There are some things in there. Letters, 11 of them. I put them there myself, one each year. They were written for you, and I never sent them, and I would rather you didn't find them by accident without knowing what they were." The room was very quiet. The hens in the yard had not yet started their morning noise. Cord shifted in his stall. She said, "Letters." I said, "One a year. Every October. I wrote them and kept them because I couldn't send them and couldn't throw them away." She was still for a moment. She said, "How long have you had this coat?" I said, "Since 1872. I bought it the 1st October after I left, and I've had it since." She held her hand out across the table. I took the coat off and gave it to her. It was an odd thing to do, handing her the coat. I felt oddly exposed without it, as if the coat had been the thing holding me together rather than the other way around. She set it in her lap and ran her fingers along the bottom of the lining until she found the place. The seam I had opened and re-sewn 11 times, each time with the same pocket knife and the same rough linen thread, each time adding one more folded sheet to the stack. She pressed the lining gently with her fingertips and felt the thickness of them inside. She looked at the coat for a long moment, her hand still. Then she looked at me and said, "Go do the morning chores. I'll tell you when breakfast is ready." I went. I fed Cord and cleaned his stall and watered the hens and collected the 4 eggs that had been laid overnight and refilled the wood box by the back door. I restacked the split wood that had shifted in the wind under the porch overhang and checked the well casing to see how it was holding in the new cold. I did everything that needed doing slowly, because I understood that she needed the time I was using to do it. It took me the better part of 2 hours. When I came back to the door, it was standing open a crack, which meant she had heard my step on the porch board and had left it open on purpose. I went in. She was sitting at the post table, not the kitchen table but the postal work table at the front of the station, the long one where she sorted the week's mail, with the coat folded across her knees and 11 sheets of paper spread out before her in a row, laid out in order from left to right, each one open flat. She was reading the last one, the one from October of 1882, the October I had buried Petra. I stood in the doorway and did not go in. The lamp was lit on the postal table. The morning light was thin and gray through the south window, and her face in the lamplight was composed and still, and I could not read what was in it. I had spent 11 Octobers writing to her in my imagination, and now she was reading the last one, and I was standing in the doorway of her post station with no more words available to me. She read to the end of the page. She set it down precisely with the others, aligning its edge. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the row of letters. 2 minutes, maybe 3, long enough that the jay came back to the east window and left again. She said finally, "You wrote about Petra dying." I said, "Yes." She said, "You wrote that she was the only steady thing you'd had for 11 years, and that you buried her in the morning and sat at the corral rail afterward, and couldn't think of a single person who would notice if you disappeared. I said, "That's what it says." She said, "Is that true?" I said, "It was true that morning. It's not true anymore." She was quiet. She said, "The letter from 1875. You wrote that you crossed the high pass in a November snow, and the only thing you thought about, clearly, was whether I still had the blue willow teapot that belonged to my mother." I said, "I still think about it. Whether you kept it." She lifted her head and looked at me. She said, "I kept it." I said, "Good." She said, "Come in and close the door. You're letting the cold in." I came in and closed the door behind me. She stacked the 11 letters in order and squared the edges and set them on the corner of the postal counter, in the corner where she placed things she intended to keep, where she put the incoming mail before distribution, where she put the county dispatches that required responses, where she put anything that had weight and required attention. She picked up the coat and looked at the open seam in the lining and ran her thumb along it. Then she put the coat on the back of her chair. She said, looking at the table, "You understand that you hurt me very badly." I said, "Yes, I do understand that." She said, "I don't mean only the leaving, I mean the years of it. I built my life around your not being here, Clem. That took work. I'm not undoing it simply because you've decided you're ready to stop moving." I said, "I know that. I'm not asking you to undo anything. I'm asking for the chance to be here and be honest, and be useful to you for whatever time I have left. That's all I'm asking." She looked up at me. I said, "I know it isn't much. Given the 11 years. I know what I'm offering doesn't balance what I owe. I'm not pretending it does." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The letter from 1878 says you were afraid I had married someone else." I said, "Yes. I thought about it most years." She said, "I thought about it too. Harker asked me twice. The second time I told him I thought I'd know how I felt about the question once it resolved itself one way or another. He understood. He's a patient man." I said nothing. She said, "He's a good man, a better man than you were for a long stretch of years." I said, "Yes." She said, "But he didn't write me 11 letters in 11 Octobers." I said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. She looked at the row of papers on the table. She had spread them back out while we were talking, and they lay in their careful line, 11 years of October lantern light in my handwriting, one after another. She looked at them for a long while. She said, "The letter from 1880. I said, "Yes." She said, "It says—" She stopped. She picked up the sheet from 1880 and looked at it. She said, "It says, I am beginning to understand that there is no version of alone that I prefer to the version of things where you are in it." I said, "Yes, that's what it says." She set the letter down. She smoothed it flat with her palm. She said, "When did you understand that?" I said, "Probably earlier than 1880. I was slow to say it even to paper." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I understand it the same way I understand weather coming in. It's just a fact of things. I can't argue with it, and I stopped trying to." She was quiet again, a long quiet this time, and I let her have it. I had been waiting 11 years, and I understood by then that her timing was her own, and always had been, and that the worst thing I could do was press it. After a while she said, "The well casing, you said you thought you got the north side properly, but you weren't certain." I said, "I can dig it out again today and check the lower course. If it needs resetting, I'll reset it before the deep freeze." She said, "Good, and the north pasture gate is still dragging. You looked at the hinge, but you didn't seat the pin properly." I said, "I'll do it right this time." She nodded. She picked up her pencil and opened her postal accounts again. I stood there a moment. She said, without looking up, "You'll want breakfast first. Sit down." I sat down. She got up and brought the coffee pot from the stove and topped off my cup and set the pot between us and sat back down and returned to her accounts, and I drank the coffee and ate the rest of the breakfast she had kept warm for me, and neither of us said anything more for a while. The frost outside began to lift as the sun came up behind the clouds, and the apple trees in the orchard caught the gray light, and somewhere in the chicken yard, the hens were beginning their morning noise. After a while I said, "Mabel." She looked up. I said, "I need to know if I'm staying or if I'm passing through. Not because I'm pressing you, because if I'm staying I need to know what I can do to earn that, and if I'm passing through, I need to know before I use up any more of your firewood." She looked at me. That same look from 1866, the direct, patient one, deciding whether a thing was worth trusting. I had been on the wrong end of that look at the postal auction for a moment, before she looked back at her papers, and then I had been the object of it for the next 4 years, in the good sense, and then I had forfeited it, and now I was standing before it again at 53 with nothing to offer but my own face, and 11 letters she had already read. She said, "You've already used up a considerable amount of my firewood, and the fence is better than it's been in 6 years, and the barn roof is sound, and the well casing is something I've been worried about for 2 seasons, and the porch board is solid, and the chicken yard drains properly, and the gate actually opens now without effort for the first time since I can remember. So from a strictly practical standpoint, I'm already in your debt." I said, "I wasn't asking about the firewood." She said, "I know you weren't." She was quiet for a moment. She set her pencil down very deliberately, the way she set things down when she had decided something. She said, "The letter from 1876. You wrote that you talked yourself out of coming back every morning for 6 months, thought you were ready to come, and talked yourself out of it by noon." I said, "That's right." She said, "What did you tell yourself, to talk yourself out of it?" I said, "That you deserved better than an explanation that would sound like an excuse, and that by then you'd probably built something better." She said, "And what would you tell yourself now, if you tried?" I said, "That I wasted 6 months of mornings on something that was never true, and that I'm too old to waste any more of them on things that aren't true." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "The north pasture gate is on the way to the well. You should look at it first. The pin will be easier to seat while the ground's still workable, and there's a better shovel in the post barn, left-hand wall, middle hook. Use that one for the casing work." I said, "All right." She said, "I'll have dinner ready at noon. If you've gotten the casing checked by then, tell me what you think it needs, and I'll put in an order to Millbrook in the next dispatch." I said, "All right." She picked up her pencil and turned back to her accounts. I got up from the table and put on the coat. She had laid it on the back of my chair, mended now, the seam closed, the lining smooth and flat and whole, and I went out into the November morning to work. The weeks after that are harder to account for cleanly, because the thing that happened in them didn't happen in moments or conversations, but in the accumulation of days. A home is built from accumulation, from the same kitchen in the morning and the same lamp in the evening, and the small knowledge of how another person takes their coffee, and where they keep the extra candles, and what sound they make when something in the postal accounts has come out wrong. I learned those things again, and she let me learn them, and that was the form the thaw took. She still did not say anything definitive. She did not say, "You're staying." She did not say, "I forgive you." She let me work and eat at her table and sleep in the post barn and come in for meals, and every week there was a little more conversation and a little less careful distance, and one evening she read aloud to me from a letter she was drafting to the County Postal Commission about route changes, because she wanted a second opinion on the phrasing, and I gave her one, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it meant more to me than I could have explained. Harker came on his Thursdays. He was consistent about it, steady and courteous and unreadable. On his 4th Thursday he stayed for supper. Mabel invited him and his daughter, a girl of about 12, and we sat at the kitchen table together and ate beans and cornbread and talked about the valley. His daughter was a composed, bright child who asked me good questions about the surveying work and listened to the answers seriously. After they left, Mabel washed the dishes and I dried them, which was not a thing we had discussed. I simply picked up the cloth, and she did not say anything about it. The second week of December, a cold front came through from the north that dropped the temperature hard and left 6 inches of snow by morning. I spent the day moving the remaining firewood under cover and checking the barn and the chicken yard for gaps in the weatherproofing, and in the afternoon I shoveled the post station porch and the path to the street and the path to the outhouse and the path to the barn. When I came in at dusk, my hands were stiff, and Mabel handed me a cup of hot coffee without comment and went back to the counter, and that night after supper she got out a deck of cards and asked if I knew a game called cribbage. I told her I knew it. We played for 2 hours at the kitchen table with the lamp between us, and she was a better player than I was, more patient, with a better memory for what had been played, and she beat me 3 games to 1, and when she set the cards down for the night, her expression had in it the same contained almost humor I remembered from years ago, the kind that came closest to the surface when she had beaten you at something fair. I thought about those evenings afterward, lying on the cot in the post barn, with Cord quiet in his stall and the winter pressing at the walls. I thought about the years I had spent on the road, the solitary camps, the way station rooms, the particular quality of evenings when there is no one to talk to and nowhere to put the day when it ends. And I thought about this, the kitchen lamp, the cribbage board, the sound of her laying down a card, the fact that she had chosen a 2-player game. I turned that over for a while, and then I let it lie, because I had learned over 11 years that turning things over past the point of clarity did not help them. The week before Christmas, she came out to the barn in the morning where I was cleaning Cord's stall and said, "There's a county license form in the office that needs a second signature. I need to know if you're willing to put your name on a government document, given your history." I set the brush down and looked at her. I said, "What kind of document?" She said, "The post station operating certificate. The county renewal. I'm adding a second name to it. It's a 5-year certificate." I said, "I can manage a government document." She said, "Good, there's a pen on the counter." I followed her in and signed my name on the line below hers, and she blotted it and folded the document into its envelope and wrote the address and sealed it and posted it herself that afternoon, the way she posted every piece of outgoing mail, with the same steady and deliberate care she gave to everything that passed through her hands. We were married in April in the post station itself, which is the right place to be married when the post station is the center of your life and your work and the thing you have built. Runa and the county clerk were the official witnesses. Harker came and stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and his daughter sat beside him in a good dress and watched the whole thing with the serious attention she brought to anything she considered worth attending to. The ceremony was short. We were not people who required ceremony. And afterward, Runa brought out a cake she had baked, a layer cake with dried apple filling, and Mabel made coffee in the blue willow pot, and we stood in the post station and ate cake and talked about the spring planting, which was going to be ambitious because I had dug out the south garden beds over the winter and there was considerably more room than there had been. Harker shook my hand when he left and held it for a moment, and then let go, and I thought he was going to say something, but he just nodded, which was enough. That was 9 years ago. I am going to try to account for what those 9 years have been like in the same plain way I have tried to account for the 11 before them, because I owe the second accounting as much as the first. They have been good years. Not easy in the way that easy years are sometimes easy. There were 2 hard winters, a late freeze that took most of the orchard's yield in 1885, a dispute with the county commission over the postal route that Mabel fought for 18 months and won on her own terms, but good in the way that good years are good, full of work that matters and a person to do it beside. I run the south pasture and the fencing and whatever the station needs from day to day. She runs the postal operation, which has grown, a 3rd dispatch per week, a parcel service to 3 neighboring counties, a new sorting agreement with the Millbrook hub. Runa is now the assistant station manager, which is a title Mabel invented and which Runa has earned several times over. The blue willow teapot is on the kitchen shelf, where it has always been. She makes tea in it on Sunday mornings, 4 cups, the right amount for 2 people. I have learned to leave the second cup where she can reach it without looking up from whatever she is reading. The 11 letters are in a cedar box in the top drawer of the postal counter, the same drawer where she keeps the deed to the station and the marriage certificate and the county license with both our names on it. She put them there herself, the morning she read them, setting them on the corner of the counter where she put things she intended to keep, and from the corner they went to the cedar box, and there they have been since. She took them out one evening in our second winter and read them to me, one by one, at the kitchen table with the lamp between us. It was a strange thing to hear my own words read back in her voice, the words I had written for myself in empty rooms across 11 years, thinking they were only ever going to be read by the man who wrote them. Some of them I was ashamed of, not for what they said but for what they represented, years of circling a thing I should have been standing in front of. Some of them made her quiet, in the way she was quiet when something mattered more than she was ready to say. When she read the one from 1880, the one about preferring no version of alone to the version where she was in it, she folded it when she was done and put it in her coat pocket and went out to do the evening chores. I don't know where she put it after that. I didn't ask. There are things a man can spend 11 years learning and still not know how to ask about, and I have decided that the not asking is sometimes the better courtesy. What she did tell me, that same winter, was about the letter from 1872. The first one I'd written, the first October after I left, when I had broken the network's rule just once and sent it through the Garnet Station Postal Exchange with my name stripped from the envelope. I had not known if it arrived. I had been afraid to find out. She told me, sitting at the table with the cedar box open between us, that she had received an unmarked envelope from Garnet Station in November of 1872, and that she had opened it and recognized the handwriting, and that she had sat with it for a long time before putting it in the cedar box where the others would eventually join it. I said, "You knew." She said, "I thought I knew. The handwriting, and something in the way it was written, it sounded like you, the way you talk when you're not performing anything." I said, "And you didn't." She said, "I wasn't ready." And then too much time had passed and I didn't know what to do with the not readiness, and so I kept it in the box and waited for things to resolve themselves. I said, 11 years is a long time to wait for something to resolve itself. She said, yes, it was. She closed the cedar box and set it back in the drawer. She said, "There's still some cake from Sunday if you want it, and put more wood on the stove. It's going to be a cold night." I put more wood on the stove and cut 2 pieces of cake and brought them to the table, and she poured the last of the Sunday tea from the blue willow pot, and we sat there in the kitchen with the lamp between us, and the winter outside doing what winter does, and it was an ordinary evening of the kind we have had several thousand of since, and it was enough. It has always been enough. I did not know, 11 years ago standing at a watering trough in Millbrook in 4 minutes of bad thinking, what enough felt like from the inside. I know it now. It feels like a kitchen lamp and a good stove and a person across the table who has read 11 years of your Octobers and decided, on the basis of the evidence, to keep you. She was worth every one of those 11 years. She was worth the 11 after. She is worth the ones ahead, which I intend to be here for, every October and all the months between, without fail, without absence, without a single unsent letter in any coat's lining, every one of them.